Hello, this is episode 4 of Unlicensed Psychology. I'm Zach the Mystic, also known as Zach Tolan for people who knew me before I was Zach the Mystic, and I'm still Zach Tolan for people who actually want me to have a last name. Tonight's lecture is on extreme introversion. I'm really glad to have my friend Ed hosting this lecture. We have a very small crowd tonight. So just so you know, I had originally intended to do this lecture on Carl Jung, who's a big hero of mine, but that seemed very esoteric, and Carl Jung is such a big topic that I found it very difficult to imagine doing a lecture on Carl Jung. Unlike the topics of lecture 1, for example, God, Carl Jung seems difficult to fit into a single lecture. So why extreme introversion? My interest in psychological types basically started when I had sort of a lot of psychological crisis. At various points in my life, I wondered why I am the way I am. And at several different critical moments, I found certain people from a distance, not in person. There was like writers, lecturers, people I saw interviewed on like PBS and such, who were able to speak directly to me in my own language. When I encountered these people, I consistently thought to myself, this person is amazing. Why didn't anybody tell me about the existence of this person? And later, I started thinking, well, why doesn't anyone I know seem to know about this person? Why are these people so obscure? They're the coolest people in the world. And so I kind of had a lot of anxiety, and I really needed a way to clear up my anxiety. And eventually, I realized that after looking at the biographies of every one of my heroes, they all had this characteristic in common, which I'm calling extreme introversion. And it's rare enough as a naturally occurring type in the population that it starts to fall into place why they wouldn't be the center of everyone's attention. Like even if take Joseph Campbell, for example, he's probably the most prominent hero of mine, but I think he's so great. Like I think they should teach him in freshman college courses, but they don't. And so, but anyway, I concluded that my heroes and I are all extreme introverts. And that more or less clears up, that basically satisfies me. It allows me to understand, well, if everyone were as introverted as I am, there will be a lot more people who appreciate Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung and the Jungian mystic Robert A. Johnson and a couple other Jungians, like Edward F. Edinger is a Jungian analyst, and Mary Louise von Franz was one of Jung's collaborators. So now I'm going to go into what I'm calling my crash course in psychological type theory. And really, this is just like enough to get started. It's not really the whole thing. But I have a PowerPoint presentation today. So I'm going. This is my first slide. As you can see, this is Zach's theory. Zach's type theory. Zach's type theory, yes, with using the MBTI notations, which is the Myers-Briggs type indicator notations. And it's based on Carl Jung's psychological types. And it starts with the 4 functions. And they're divided up into 2 categories The thinking or logic function, then the feeling and ethics function, also known as T and F, are called the rational functions. And the sensation function, the intuition function, S and N, they're the irrationals. That's all you need to know about irrational and irrational for today. But the thing to note is that these are these four functions, T, F, S, and N. Okay, next slide. Now, there's more than one of each function. There's an extroverted there's an extroverted version of thinking, feeling, sensation into it, and an introverted version. And so I just drew that here. And what's funny is that your extroverted thinking function could be much smarter than your introverted thinking function, which is actually what is true about me. And your introverted sensation function and your extroverted sensation function are actually two different things. So in a way, there's actually 8 functions instead of 4. But it is convenient to divide them into these two because they do have a lot in common. Extroverted and introverted intuition, both sort of, they do have similarities. Anyway, so this is the diagram of one person. Everyone has an extroverted soul and an introverted soul. That's basically all you need to start learning about introversion and extroversion, except that I thought I'd just throw in my own IQ chart, my IQ chart, because I think this system needs to get more attention. My extroverted thinking is an 8, my extroverted feeling is a 5, and I just marked them on a 1 through 9 scale. That's kind of arbitrary, but it's kind of enough digits to get a basic sense of sort of what your IQ is in each area. And this is my own system, and I hope that more people adopt it because, I don't know, I've been using it myself for a while, and it really works. And I haven't seen anybody else use this system. So anyway, everybody also has an introvert-extrovert ranking. And mine, this is introversion. Mine's way up here on the introverted scale. And that's peculiar. It creates a kind of an extreme type of person just by having introvert-extrovert. This isn't really IQ because the more you get of one, the less you get of the other. And so it's kind of a tit-for-tat kind of thing. It's not just a straight intelligence factor. So to review, and just to just to let you know my basic type system and the way I think about it. Everyone has an introvert and extrovert soul, and the two different souls can be completely different in the same person. And a high IQ in one function, either you're introvert or extroverted, doesn't correlate to a high IQ in any other function. So you get 8 completely different IQs in the functions, plus 1 introvert-extrovert rating. And just to be controversial and provocative, I added this sentence. All traits are genetically inherited. All your IQs and your introvert-extrovert rating are genetically inherited, and they're fixed for life. And you're even observable. If you look at different families, you can see strong or weak functions being transmitted from one sibling or parent to the child. And now back to tonight's topic, which is extreme introversion. I have a couple more diagrams. So here's your chart of extroversion and introversion, and this line, it represents a human biorhythm. It's not always like as you go through time. So you'll be up here and then down here. And the time isn't, this is kind of an abstraction, but it works pretty well for understanding the idea. So here's the extreme extrovert's line down here, which means a lot of his line will be spent using his extroverted soul for his life. and the little bit for introversion, and the extreme introvert up here, and then you get your regular introverts, and your regular extroverts. Just to be even more clear, this is the diagram for an extreme introvert, and yeah. So here's the good and the bad of being an extreme introvert, illustrated in this diagram, is that you got this huge ability to concentrate and to look inward, to focus inwardly, and to use all that intelligence towards something that's deeply focused and concentrated. But you pay a price. You only have a little bit of extroversion, which means your ability to use extroverted skills can be way behind. And extroverted skills are very good for social skills. So a lot of times, an extreme introvert will have limited social skills, or they won't. Their ability to navigate a crowd, so to say, will be significantly lacking. So I like to do readings. Sometimes the readings are boring. I'm going to try to make these readings as exciting as I can, because sometimes I think looking back through history definitely allows people to get a sense of the fact that this thing wasn't invented yesterday. And so basically the rest of I have a few more of my own ideas that I want to talk about, and then I'm going to just go into some interesting historical parallels to this topic. So I'm going to start with Isaac Newton, who was alive in a critical time, and he was a critical person in the time he was alive, because he brought forth in a lot of ways modern science as we know it by discovering the mathematical nature of the planetary bodies and the first description of gravity that actually conformed to mathematical laws. So Isaac Newton's a pretty big deal. And the poet Alexander Pope wrote this: "Nature and nature's laws lay hid by night. God said, 'Let Newton be,' and all was light." So that encaptures the scientific revolution almost in a nutshell. But I'm saying Newton was an extreme introvert, and when he was working on his big book, his most important book, the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, and maybe maybe the most important book in science or in the history of science. So it's definitely on the top 10. But here's a description of how he was when he was working on the book. And this quote from, I think, Wikipedia. I got it from Wikipedia. "Newton's single-minded attention to his work generally, and to his project during this time, is shown by later reminiscences from his secretary and copyist of the period, Humphrey Newton. His account tells of Isaac Newton's absorption in his studies, how he sometimes forgot his food or his sleep or the state of his clothes, and how when he took a walk in his garden, he would sometimes rush back to his room with some new thought, not even waiting to sit before beginning to write it down. Other evidence also shows Newton's absorption in the Principia. Newton for years kept up a regular program of chemical or alchemical experiments, and he normally kept dated notes of them. But for a period from May 1684 to April 1686, Newton's chemical notebooks have no entries at all. So it seems that Newton abandoned pursuits to which he was normally dedicated and did very little else for well over a year and a half, but concentrated on developing and writing what became his great work." And I think of this as a really great demonstration of extreme introversion, because it shows kind of the lack of social life And the power of the mind of the extreme introvert if it gets onto an idea, it can withdraw, deprive itself of things that most people wouldn't ordinarily want to deprive themselves of. But it can come up with the most elegant theories. And so it's a good illustration of both the good and the bad. I want to talk briefly about some things that Carl Jung's psychology points out. Jung became really interested in the differences between the different proposed psychologies of his time. Sigmund Freud is the most prominent other psychologist, and Jung was so unenthusiastic about one of his competitors, whose name was Alfred Adler, that he almost ends up dismissing him as a mind altogether, and he ends up replacing him with Friedrich Nietzsche. And so for him, the big contest was between Sigmund Freud and Friedrich Nietzsche. And Sigmund Freud's psychology was all about this pleasure principle. And from my experience as an extreme introvert, the idea that everything is unconsciously rooted in the pleasure principle is very difficult to swallow, and it just doesn't ring true with me. With Friedrich Nietzsche, though, the overriding principle by which a person could be overwhelmed by the unconscious was the will to power. Okay, and as an extreme introvert, I get it. The will to power is an overwhelming instinct. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, also an extreme introvert, is a story about the will to power. It's about the power drive, and it's very difficult to impose. It's kind of almost a joke to impose Sigmund Freud's idea of the pleasure principle onto the story of the Lord of the Rings, and to see all of the hobbits and elves and dwarves as just unconscious manifestations of a sexual urge. It's just not that sexual a story, and yet Sigmund Freud nonetheless became extremely popular. And after a lot of thinking, I ended up kind of concluding that the reason that it was possible for the idea of this pleasure, unconscious sex drive and pleasure principle to become the most popular theory was because it's just the sheer number of people who are extroverts. And maybe for extroverts, it's not so implausible to suggest that pleasure and sex are the dominant, overriding, unconscious forces in people's lives. Where to an introverted point of view, I'm more of kind of feel like things are more like the Lord of the Rings, where the issue is whether or not you grab hold of power when you have the opportunity, and whether you're willing to pay the price, and how you learn how to resist grabbing hold of power when it's not good for you. So I want to talk about the disadvantages of being an introvert, and I sort of would like to use, there's definitely disadvantages, but I want to raise the issue of J.D. Salinger, author of The Catcher in the Rye. So The Catcher in the Rye, obviously a hugely important book, and anyone examining the life and times of J.D. Salinger could not conclude anything else but that he was an extreme introvert. He's just an archetypal example of an extreme introvert. And I raise him specifically because he's also an example of where it's possible that his social skills are not good, really, that his poor performance on this introvert-extrovert thing, his like lack of enough time devoted to being an extrovert, kind of led him to it cost him a lot in terms of his personal life, and he didn't, arguably he just didn't succeed that well in his personal life. And you can just research that, but I think he's famous enough that you probably know something about it. So, yeah, the inner life is so complex and detailed, and the natural ability to deal with crowds so lacking that extreme introverts will seem in their personality like a castle or a fortress. They can even become good at conveying depth and intelligence when there isn't that much depth and intelligence actually in the castle. But because their extroversion is so weak, which means it's really hard to do certain human interactions which are really basic for all other types, a lot of effort is put into making the castle walls seem strong and foreboding. So in our modern society, just a number of examples of introverts and extroverts, or just introverts in this lecture. People who like fantasy, J.R.R. Tolkien, and science fiction. People who love board games, any game, like people who really like to sit around a table and play games, whether it's like you can play role-playing games or chess. They're typically introverts, if not extreme introverts. And the geek culture, nerd and geek culture, is just mostly saturated with introverts. That's more or less the modern incarnation of how introverts have fun and get together and do stuff. And a whole ton of really good computer programmers also are extreme introverts. There's another interesting phenomenon in which several of the most horrible sort of people in our culture have been extreme introverts. Like serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer gives all of the evidence of extreme introverts, as do, like, more recently, Adam Lanza, the Sandy Hook killer. It would seem maybe extreme introversion wasn't his only problem, but it was certainly one of his characteristics. And that was also true with Swang Hui Cho, the Virginia Tech killer. So that's sort of like that's sort of like a manifestation of the dark side of extreme introversion. Now, the light side, I definitely would say Albert Einstein is definitely extreme introvert. I have a few from the 19th century, like Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, and Emily Dickinson. But there's really a lot, and I'm just sort of randomly selecting. But I'm also hesitantly saying that Jim Henson, creator of the Muppets, was also an extreme introvert, although I haven't really read his recent biography. So I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure. I get the hint that he's also sort of like, one of the good guys, or so you need your good guys and your bad guys, and so I wanted to come up with a bunch of those. And then you have also like your technology nerds, like Bill Gates I would say is an extreme introvert, and then George Lucas, creator of Star Wars, also an extreme introvert. And last but not least, my heroes, the Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, I mentioned them before, Robert A. Johnson, Edward F. Edinger, a lot of like really deep philosophers. Like the archetypal deep philosopher in the cafe will be an extreme introvert. Although you can have exceptions, and you don't want to make rules about it, because like there's a philosopher, Slavoj Žižek, Zizek, and to me he gives all the evidence of being an extrovert. So he's just really smart, but he doesn't act at all like an introvert. And so just because you're a philosopher doesn't make you an extreme introvert. All right, that's the first thing. Now, if you're looking throughout history for like good examples of people who were thinking about this type of topic, maybe they didn't use the words like introvert and extrovert, but they were astute observers of people regardless. You would do a lot worse than Ralph Waldo Emerson, who wrote a lot of great essays and was a great writer. And I'm going to read his essay, like a bunch of segments of his essay called The Transcendentalist. And so back in the 1800s, Transcendentalism was like a legitimate sort of movement. And Emerson was probably the most prominent figure in the movement. But you got also Henry David Thoreau is another one that's identified with Transcendentalism. But the very essay in which Transcendentalism is described has this very, very uncanny resemblance to a description, to a dead-on description of an extreme introvert. And I highly recommend it. So much so that I made a special PowerPoint chart just so that you would know what I'm talking about. Just so that you could know the name. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the Transcendentalist. Now, Emerson is such a good writer, and he has such good descriptions of extreme introvert if you read his essay, that I'm basically going to spend the rest of this lecture reading his essay. This is about half of it. I selected the parts that are most accurate descriptions. But also, it turns out Emerson has a modern feeling a little bit in his writing, which, although it was written in 1842, I actually couldn't describe better some of the things that he's getting at. So now his word, he exchanges these words, materialists and idealists. So here, this is that second word, idealist, that for Emerson is basically, in my opinion, interchangeable with introvert. And now, as you'll see, a transcendentalist also is the same thing as an idealist, which is, in my opinion, same thing as an introvert. Now remember, the words introvert and extrovert didn't even come into popular usage until Carl Jung used them in the 1920s to describe personality types. So those words weren't even around and available. But listen to what Emerson has to say. I'm going to do my best Emerson right now. The first thing we have to say respecting what are called new views here in New England at the present time is that they are not new, but the very oldest of thoughts cast into the mold of these times, these new times. The light is always identical in its composition, but it falls on a great variety of objects, and by so falling is first revealed to us, not in its own form, for it is formless, but in theirs. In like manner, thought only appears in the objects it classifies. What is popularly called transcendentalism among us is idealism, which, by aside, I'm going to just start saying introversion for idealism, and you can go and back and you can criticize me all you want, but I'm going to use the word introversion. Introversion, as it appears in 1842 or 2013. As thinkers, mankind have ever divided into two sects, materialists and idealists, extroverts and introverts. The first class founding on experience, the second on consciousness. The first class beginning to think from the data of the senses. The second class perceive that the senses are not final, and say the senses give us representations of things. But what are the things themselves they cannot tell. The materialist, or extrovert, insists on facts, on history, on the force of circumstances, and the animal wants of man. The idealist, on the power of thought and of will, on inspiration, on miracle, on individual culture. These two modes of thinking are both natural. The introvert, in speaking of events, sees them as spirits. He does not deny the sensuous fact, by no means, but he will not see that alone. He does not deny the presence of this table, this chair, and the walls of this room. But he looks at these things as the reverse side of the tapestry, as the other end, each being a sequel or completion of a spiritual fact which concerns him. This introverted manner of looking at things transfers every object in nature from an independent and anomalous position out there, that's old language, out there, into the consciousness. Even the materialist, Condillac, perhaps the most logical expounder of materialism, was constrained to say, though we should soar into the heavens, though we should sink into the abyss, we never go out of ourselves. It is always our own thought that we perceive. What more could an introvert say? The introvert does not respect labor or the products of labor, namely property, otherwise than as a manifold symbol, illustrating with wonderful fidelity of details the laws of being. He does not respect government except as far as it reiterates the law of his mind, nor the church, nor charities, nor arts for themselves, but hears, at a vast distance, what they say, as if his consciousness would speak to him through a pantomimic scene. His thought, that is the universe. It is simpler to be self-dependent. The height, the deity of man, is to be self-sustained, to need no gift, no foreign force. The company of others is good when it does not violate me, but best when it is likest to solitude. Do not cumber yourself with fruitless pains to mend and remedy remote effects. Let the soul be erect, and all things will go well. You think me the child of my circumstances. I make my circumstance. I, this thought which is called I, is in the mold into which the world is poured like melted wax. You call it the power of circumstance, but it is the power of me. Am I in harmony with myself? My position will seem to you just and commanding. Am I vicious and insane? My fortunes will seem to you obscure and descending. As I am, so shall I associate, and so shall I act. Caesar's history will paint out Caesar. Jesus acted so because he thought so. I do not wish to overlook or to gainsay any reality. I say, I make my circumstance. But if you ask me, whence am I feel my relation to that fact which cannot be spoken or defined, nor even thought, but which exists and will exist. You will see by this sketch that there is no such thing as a pure transcendentalist or a pure introvert. That we know of none but prophets and heralds of such a philosophy. That all by whose strong bias of nature have leaned to the spiritual side in doctrine, have stopped short of their goal. We have had many harbingers and forerunners, but of a purely spiritual life, history has afforded no example. I mean, we have yet no man who has leaned entirely on his character or his introverted nature, and eaten angel's food, who, trusting in his sentiments, found life made of miracles, who, working for universal aims, found himself fed, he knew not how, clothed, sheltered, and weaponed, he knew not how, and yet it was done by his own hands. So Emerson's going straight to one of Carl Jung's points, that no one is a pure extrovert, no one is a pure introvert, that every human being depends to some extent on having both. This introverted way of thinking, falling on Roman times, made Stoic philosophers. falling on despotic times made patriot Catos and Brutuses. Falling on superstitious times made prophets and apostles. On popish times made Protestants and ascetic monks, preachers of faith against the preachers of works. On pre-latical times made Puritans and Quakers. And falling on Unitarian and commercial times makes the peculiar shades of idealism which we know. And I read that to convey you a sense of the 1842 kind of language that Emerson is thinking and writing in. This is my favorite part. It is a sign of our times, conspicuous to the coarsest observer, that many intelligent and religious persons withdraw themselves from the common labors and competitions of the market and the caucus, and betake themselves to a certain solitary and critical way of living, from which no solid fruit has yet appeared to justify their separation. And so Emerson's anticipating that some solid fruit may justify the introverted way of life in 1842, and I would argue that now there's plenty of fruit to justify the introverted way of life. Carl Jung's psychology is one of them. But anyway, so these people hold themselves aloof. They feel the disproportion between their faculties and the work offered them, and they prefer to ramble in the country and perish of ennui than to the degradation of such charities and such ambitions as the city can propose to them. They are striking work and crying out for somewhat worthy to do. What they do is done only because they are overpowered by the humanities that speak on all sides, and they consent to such labor as is open to them, though to their lofty dream of writing Iliads or Hamlets, or the building of cities or empires, such labor seems drudgery. Now everyone must do after his kind, be he asp or angel, and these must. The question, which is a wise man and a student of modern history will ask, which is what that kind is. And truly, as in ecclesiastical history, we take so much pains to know what the Gnostics, what the Essenes, what the Manichees, and what the Reformers believed, it would not misbecome us to inquire nearer home what these companions and contemporaries of ours think and do, at least so far as these thoughts and actions appear to be not accidental and personal, but common to many, and the inevitable flower of the tree of time. Our American literature and spiritual history are, we confess, in the optative mood. But whoso knows these seething brains, these admirable radicals, these unsocial worshippers, these talkers who talk the sun and moon away, will believe that this heresy cannot pass away without leaving its mark. New, we confess, and by no means happy is our condition. If you want to aid our labor, we stand in greater want of the labor ourselves. We are miserable with inaction. This is the voice of the Transcendentalist. We perish of rest and rust, but we do not like your work. Then, says the world, show me your own. We have none, says the Transcendentalist. What will you do then, cries the world. We will wait, says the extreme introvert. How long, says the world? Until the universe rises up and calls us to work. But whilst you wait, you grow old and useless. Be it so. I can sit in a corner and perish, as you call it. But I will not move until I have the highest command. If no call should come for years, for centuries, then I know that the desire of the universe is the attestation of faith by my abstinence. Your virtuous projects, so-called, do not cheer me. I know that which shall come will cheer me. If I cannot work, at least I need not lie. All that is clearly due today is not to lie. And almost right on cue, Emerson now talks about the deficiencies of some extreme introverts. There is no doubt a great deal of well-founded objection to be spoken or felt against the sayings and doings of this class, some of whose traits we have selected. No doubt they will lay themselves open to criticism and to lampoons, and as ridiculous stories will be told of them as any. There will be cant and pretension. There will be subtlety and moonshine. These persons are of unequal strength and do not all prosper. They complain that everything around them must be denied. And if feeble, it takes all their strength to deny before they can begin to lead their own life. Grave old men insist on their respect to this institution and that usage, to an obsolete history, to some vocation or college, or etiquette, or beneficiary, or charity, or morning or evening call, which they resist as what does not concern them. But it costs such sleepless nights, alienations, and misgivings. They have so many moods about it. These old guardians never change their minds. They have but one mood on the subject, namely, that Antony is very perverse, that it is quite as much as Antony can do to assert his rights, abstain from what he thinks foolish, and keep his temper. He cannot help the reaction of this injustice in his own mind. He is braced up and stilted. All freedom and flowing genius, all sallies of wit and frolic nature are quite out of the question. It is well if he can keep from lying, injustice, and suicide. There is no time for gaiety and grace. His strength and spirits are wasted in rejection. But the strong spirits overpower those around them without effort. Their thought and emotion comes in like a flood, quite withdraws them from all notice of these carping critics. They surrender themselves with glad heart to the heavenly guide, and only by implication reject the clamorous nonsense of the hour. So Emerson's just such a good writer. I just feel like I want to read it. I hope you stick with me. We're approaching the end. But all these of whom I speak are not proficients. They are novices. They only show the road in which man should travel. When the soul has greater health and prowess, yet let them feel the dignity of their charge and deserve a larger power. Their heart is the ark in which the fire is concealed, which shall burn in a broader and universal flame. Let them obey the genius then most when his impulse is wildest, then most when he seems to lead to uninhabitable deserts of thought and life. For the path which the hero travels alone is the highway of health and benefit to mankind. What is the privilege and nobility of our nature but its persistency through its power to attach itself to what is permanent? And then a great conclusion. I just had to say that. I don't know. I just want to tell you it's a great conclusion. One last paragraph. Amidst the downward tendency and proneness of things, when every voice is raised for a new road or another statute, or a subscription of stock, for an improvement in dress or in dentistry, for a new house or a larger business, for a political party or the division of an estate, will you not tolerate one or two solitary voices in the land, speaking for thoughts and principles not marketable or perishable? Soon these improvements and mechanical inventions will be superseded. These modes of living lost out of memory. These cities rotted, ruined by war, by new inventions, by new seats of trade, or the geologic changes. All gone. Like the shells which sprinkle the sea beach with a white colony today, forever renewed, to be forever destroyed. But the thoughts which these few hermits strove to proclaim by silence, as well as by speech, not only by what they did, but by what they forbore to do, shall abide in beauty and strength, to reorganize themselves in nature, to invest themselves anew in other, perhaps higher endowed, and happier mixed clay than ours, in fuller union with the surrounding system. So that's all I had. I'm going to take a break, and if we have a discussion, we'll do that.